Well, let me introduce myself. I'm Gregory Tanbara. I'm a Sansei, lifetime resident of the city of Tacoma. That's the same city that my Nisei father, Dr. George Tanbara, had a chance to practice medicine for 53 years. And my Nisei mother, Kimiko Tanbara, lived pretty much all of her life there. Both of them are gone now, but they lived well into their 90s. I work for the Tacoma Pierce County Health Department. I'm married to Barbara. I have two daughters, both of them grown now. Their names are Madison and Eleanor. So that's me, Greg Tanbara.
Thanks, Greg. I'm Lisa Hoffman, and I'm faculty in the School of Urban Studies at University of Washington, Tacoma. And I'm trained as a cultural anthropologist, and along with Mary, who will introduce herself in a moment, we recently published a book, Becoming Nisei, Japanese American Urban Lives in Pre-War Tacoma. Mary?
I'm Mary Hanneman, and I also teach at University of Washington, Tacoma, and I teach modern Japanese history. So that's kind of what brought me to this project.
So Mary and Lisa asked me to kind of moderate our conversation here, and I'm just really flattered to be able to do that. I've had a chance to read Becoming Nisei, and it's a really cool book. So let's get started here. Can you tell us, Lisa and Mary, why you got involved in this project? Yeah, let's just start there. Okay. Why did you get involved in this project? What was the idea to this?
Yeah, we got involved in this project actually in the early 2000s. As you know, we both teach at UW-Tacoma, and that on the campus footprint of UW-Tacoma was the Japanese language school, a very important building in Tacoma's Japanese community. And the decision was made to demolish the building. A historical review process was undertaken to see if the building could be refurbished, decided that it couldn't be done without drastically changing kind of the historical significance of the building. So the building was torn down. And when that happened, the school put out a call to ask people if they wanted to get involved in a project about the building, kind of recognizing that the destruction of this building was really part of the erasure of the Tacoma Japanese community. So at that time, Lisa and I both kind of stepped forward, even though neither one of us are Asian American scholars, Asian Americanists. As I mentioned earlier, I teach Japanese history. And so what brought me to the project was that interest in modern Japanese history, especially late 19th and early 20th century history, when Japan was undergoing this very important transition into modernity. One of my main questions in my scholarship is how that transition to modernity kind of impacted the Japanese identity, national identity. And so I kind of brought that question and transnationalized it, if you will, kind of made it into a transnational question. How did that national identity kind of translate, that modernizing national identity, translate as the immigrant, Japanese immigrants came to the United States West Coast. So that's kind of how I got started in the project and how the project got started. And Lisa can talk about her questions and her involvement.
Yeah. So as a cultural anthropologist, I have always been particularly interested in how we come to be who we are in the world. So I've really been focused on identity formation, or what we say in our jargon, subject formation. And I've always been interested in its links to where we are. So you could say that it's about placemaking and people making, or a little more jargon, spatiality and subjectivity. So I was very compelled by the prominence of this particular building, the Japanese language school, and the significance of its erasure and tearing it down in Tacoma. So what role did it play for the people who attended, for the community? How did it impact how they saw each other and saw themselves in the world? And therefore, what does it mean, as Mary also talked about, to see this kind of erasure? And so that's what drew me to the project. And so Mary and I, in this sense, not being historians of America or of the Asian American experience in particular, kind of drew on our own disciplines to kind of hopefully add something to the literature on this, on the pre-war times. But Greg, you also have a special connection to this building. So and maybe you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, and I think I think what I'd like to say first of all is, you know, both Lisa and Mary were talking about identity, and when Lisa first approached me about this project, I said, well, sure, this sounds like a very interesting project because I've got some connection with the building. But in taking a look at becoming Nisei, yeah, it does have awful lot to do with identity. And I'll tell you a little bit about what my connection is. My grandmother, Mitsu Fujimoto, had a home that's actually just across the street from the Tacoma Buddhist Temple, which is the other building in what's left of the Japanese district in Tacoma. And across the alley was the Japanese language school. And through a series of circumstances, she ended up having ownership of that building. I think when World War II started, the school, of course, had to shut down, and they were looking at just liquidating that property. They needed to get rid of it real quick. My grandmother felt that it was important because the war would only last for a certain period of time, that institution still be something that the Japanese community might be able to make use of after the World War II was over with. So through that circumstance, she ended up owning that building. Where my family comes in is my father, George Tanbara, as I was telling you, was a physician. Well, he ended up through a series of circumstances having the opportunity to go to medical school after he served in the U.S. Army and their counterintelligence corps, and used a GI Bill to actually go on and his medical degree. And he had met my mother in Heart Mountain relocation camp. She had been a person that had lived in Tacoma all her life, just across the alley from the Japanese language school and across the street from the Tacoma Buddhist Temple. And so when he finished his training up in Seattle, he didn't have any place to live, and my mom had just had me, and it was 1955, and they thought, well, we need to get down to Tacoma close to my mom's folks, and my grandmother let them stay in the teachers' quarters of the Japanese language school. So I have very vague memories of that building. From that time, I recall going in kind of a front door on the alley, and you could take a look up the stairs and I could see the school bell. I imagine they used to ring to start classes. I remember the place was very dusty. I remember there were bookshelves with books in them, all Japanese books. And it reminded me, I mean, it was a little creepy because it was like a school with nobody there. So those are my memories. We stayed there for a couple of years. So I was intrigued with this proposition that Lisa and Mary had, that maybe I get a chance to talk to them a little bit about the Japanese language school. And I actually attended there for a little bit. They tried getting the Japanese language school up and running again. There were a few of us that whose parents forced to go on Saturday mornings, and instead of going to play baseball or whatever. Unfortunately, I think my mother and her sisters were all students there. They're all smarter than I am because they learned Japanese while they were going to Japanese language school. I did not. I just don't have a talent that way. But anyway, that's my connection. And as it turns out, I have lived pretty much my whole life in the city of Tacoma, and off and on, I have run into the Japanese language school throughout my life. When the university had purchased it, I was really happy about that because I thought that was a good place for it to go. I was also involved in the memorial that the university put together, a bronze statue called Maru. So that's kind of my connection to the Japanese language school. So with that, maybe what I'd like to do is, because I've lived in Tacoma for a long time, and Tacoma is not a city that you hear a lot about in Japanese American history. So why is this institution in Tacoma significant? And I'll just throw it to the both of you.
Yeah, well, thanks, because that's a great question. And I thought, first of all, since we have a broader audience than just the Puget Sound, that we should probably say that Tacoma is a city in Western Washington, just about 35 miles south of Seattle. And why, and to answer, kind of speak to your question, Greg, I think we need to think first in terms of population and size, like what makes Tacoma and the Japanese community in Tacoma important. And because we were looking at the Japanese language school, we're really looking at the pre-war period. And we interviewed a number of the alums from the school, and they were young Nisei school children, in the 1920s and 1930s, up until, as you mentioned, the school was closed down in 1942. In 1920, Tacoma had a Japantown, Nihonmachi, that was, in terms of kind of size per capita, how do I put this? It was the largest of any American city based on per capita city size. Doesn't mean that we had the most number of Japanese residents here, but for a city of our size, we had the largest percentage of Japanese residents. So Tacoma was very important in that sense, as a community of Japanese and Japanese Americans. It was also of interest to the Japanese government in the late 1800s, because Tacoma was an up-and-coming city. Tacoma at that time, there was kind of a competition between Tacoma and Seattle as to which would become the primary city of the Pacific Northwest. Tacoma was the terminus of the Northern Pacific Railroad. It had some Japanese shipping companies that had headquarters here. And I think because it's one thing that's important to remember is that Japanese immigrants by law were not allowed to become naturalized US citizens. And as a result of that, they remained, of course, citizens of Japan or subjects of Japan. And their connection to the Japanese government was very important. And the Japanese government also recognized that. And so recognized the need to maintain consulates, particularly in the West Coast of the United States. So the Japanese government looked at Tacoma as a possible locale for its consulate in the Northwest part of the US, and considered locating a consulate here, and in fact did open a consulate here in 1895. But as Seattle kind of took over and looked to be the emerging city, the consulate was transferred there in 1900. But nevertheless, the Pacific Northwest remained really one of the most important entry points for Japanese immigrants in the United States, and labor contracting companies in both Seattle and Tacoma meant that of the almost by 1900, about over 12,000 Japanese who had been admitted to the United States had come through, about half of them had come through the Pacific Northwest, through Seattle and Tacoma. And so Lisa can talk a little bit more about that community and what this meant for Tacoma specifically, the Japanese community in Tacoma.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. So a number of the Issei, the first generation, came through those labor contractors, and they were working in fishing, the canneries, and the lumber industry, both some in logging outside of the city, but many in the sawmills. And we were actually struck by how many of those that we interviewed, over half, had family members, fathers, that had worked in the sawmills. So for instance, in 1917 in Tacoma alone, there were approximately 50 sawmills, and they employed about 1,300 Japanese workers. And by 1922, that had increased to over 2,000. So really significant number in that industry. Then we see in the 1920s that many families started to open small businesses, and you start to get more of that entrepreneurial kind of ethnic enclave type of a situation. And this is when you start to see, after some of the gentleman's agreement and the immigration rules, where only the women were allowed to come, but no more single men, that the Issei started to have families, and they were getting married, they brought wives over, they started having children. And so some scholars call this the transition from the frontier to the settler period, or the family period. What's interesting is that I'll give you an example of one of those that we interviewed, Perry Yoshiaki Yano. He told us that his father arrived in Seattle in 1906. He first owned a pool hall with friends. And then when his wife arrived, apparently that was no longer a respectable business. So he started working on farms. Then he got into vegetable delivery. And then finally he opened his own marketplace. So it's really, I'm going to show you a couple of maps as we talk here. Hopefully that has come through the screen. And you can see there's this concentration in the downtown core, but all of these dots, and this map is in the book, all of these dots show other places where the Japanese community lived. And then also here down on the tide flats where they worked in the sawmills. So what's interesting is, as Mary noted, that the Japanese were a larger percent of the population in Tacoma than in other major cities on the West Coast. And I'm going to just switch us over to, this is the downtown concentration, and we'll show you a clip in a moment of somebody who provides a really beautiful description of Broadway in downtown Tacoma between 13th and 15th. And again, this map is in the book. But what's significant here is that even though it was not the largest population compared to places like LA and San Francisco and Seattle, it was still a significant population. So before we do more on those little details, I want to share this clip of Ryo Munakata explaining what used to be and what has become erased.
And next door to that was a Japanese confection store, and they also sold Japanese magazines and books. And next to that, there was a family named Takahashi that ran a grocery store. And then next to that was a rice bowl Chinese food place run by a Chinese family. And next to that was a Mr. Hoshige's pharmacy drugstore. And those stores were in a building on the corner of 15th and Broadway. And it's called New Washington Hotel. And it was run by a family named Suyama. And very corner, first floor, was another food stand, ice cream fountain. And in the back was a pool room, and run by a family named Obayashi, I think it was. And on the side that I lived, there were less. But I remember a drugstore in the corner where we, as a child, we'd go there and buy something, and the druggist would give us a piece of candy. And then, so when we needed something from the drugstore, we always volunteered. And then further down the street, my father had his new Tacoma Hotel. And then there was a photographer. There was another barber shop. And next to that, there was a tailor shop by the family of Nakata, named Nakata. And then further down the street, there was a family that had a gift shop. They also sold fishing tackle. And by gift, I mean not small gifts, but they were very elaborate and expensive gifts. And the name was Mr. Niyama, Niyama. And then we go down the street. There was a market, another Chinese food restaurant. And then there was a shoe repair store that also sold new shoes. And the man's name was Mr. Kawai. And in fact, his son is here for the meeting. And at the corner was a dry goods store. And so
Apologies, it's just coming to the end. But he has this unbelievable, beautiful memory of those streets between Broadway, between 13th and 15th. And so we just want to take a note because we realize that many people in the audience are familiar with other places, and we want to emphasize what's special and unique about Tacoma, but also familiar to these other situations. Historian Roger Daniels called Los Angeles the chief city of Japanese America in pre-war times. Then San Francisco, which had 5,000 Japanese Americans, was considered the cultural lead. But Seattle had almost 7,000 in 1940. So Daniels argued the real second city of Japanese America was Seattle. And then if you include Pierce County, where Tacoma is located, that was another 2,000 Japanese immigrants. And this is all in the pre-war time. So only Sacramento, Stockton, Portland, and New York City had as many as 1,000 Japanese Americans pre-war. So Tacoma and Pierce County are actually a really significant population, and we should understand what was happening in this city. It's also, we want to emphasize that there are these layers of what we call in the book, and we'll talk about a little bit more later, these layers of structural forgetting. And kind of a collective amnesia. And so this is also the ancestral lands of the Puyallup. And so recognizing those indigenous populations that have been erased as well is really important. So I think Greg's puppies, oh, is he?
There's this contest that happens every time the mailman comes. The question is, can Baloo catch all the mail before it comes through the mail slot and hits the floor? Can he grab it out of the mailman's hands? So I apologize for that, but yeah, that's part of life in my house. So thank you very much, Lisa and Mary. You know, as you folks were talking, it reminded me, one of the things that I always wondered as a kid was why my grandfather, Masataka Fujimoto, why did he come to Tacoma? And it was because all of these things were happening in and around the railroad and lumber and so on and so forth. So, you know, that's something that that jumped out at me as we were talking here. The other thing that I recall is my mother used to say that she remembers as a child that there were so many Japanese that, and their lives revolved around going to the Japanese grocery store, or going to the Japanese cleaners, or going to Japanese hotels. And she also said that there were lots and lots of single men when she was very, very young. Many of them working in the mills, many of them working in other places also. So I think are we ready for our next question? Okay. You know, and in amongst all of these conversations that my mom used to, these actually stories, they were stories that she used to tell. Mixed in all of that, you always end up coming back to the Japanese language school. That was always interesting to me. And me not having grown up in Nihonmachi, these were like legends that I would hear during Thanksgiving and Christmas gatherings. And, you know, just even when I stopped over to my folks' house to get to do my laundry or to get a free meal or something. But I'd always hear these things. And so Lisa, Mary, tell us more about the language school and its importance in Tacoma. Like I was saying, I lived there for a short period of time, but it was quite a thing. And my mother and her sisters would sit at these different family gatherings, and they'd have lots of stories about that Japanese language school. And Dr. Munakata was always part of those stories also, because he was a dear, dear friend of my mother and her sisters. So tell us about the importance.
Well, Japanese language schools were not unusual along the West Coast and in Hawaii. But what was unusual in the case of Tacoma as a Japanese language school, there was just one in the city. And that kind of gets back to what we've been talking about, the size of the population, the size of the city, that it was big enough to have a Japanese language school, but not so big that there needed to be more than one, or that there was more tthan one. The other thing about Tacoma's Japanese language schools, it was a secular school. It was run not by a Buddhist church, not by a Christian church, but the community got together and kind of said, this one school that brought the community together, really functioned as kind of a community center for Tacoma's Japanese community. It was founded by the community first in 1911, when a group got together and decided that this was, Lisa talked a little bit about, the kind of the history of immigration. And, first, as Greg, as you just mentioned, first there were single men, and then they were able to bring their wives over. They started families. And so by 1911, when there were some children that were kind of joining the community, then the decision was made that, well, we need to have a Japanese language school. And so starting in 1911, they operated a language school in rented quarters, but soon started fundraising to build a permanent structure. That permanent structure was completed in 1923, and it functioned from that point until 1942, when, due to war and incarceration, it was closed down. Greg, you mentioned that after in the 1950s, they tried to reconstitute the school, and that you kind of resisted going on Saturdays, but your mom went every day after school, as you know, and thus she has many stories to tell. But the point is that the school had a very rigorous curriculum in Tacoma, and it met daily, Monday through Friday after school, and they often had weekend activities, but 2 hours a day after school, each weekday. And the alums remembered, and in fact, not only did many of them speak Japanese in their own homes, but because of their instruction at the Japanese language school, they were very adept at Japanese. And people that we interviewed and talked to, they said, when Tacoma people got together, we were able to speak Japanese all the time. We spoke Japanese. They said Japanese from Tacoma could speak Japanese pretty well. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we go along, because that would become significant during the war itself, with many of the people, the young men in the service who served in the US military from Tacoma, actually served in, like you mentioned, your dad, Greg, served in the military intelligence service. So we can talk a little bit more about that as we go along. I think Lisa has a picture to show of we found a number of materials in the archives in the University of Washington library, but this is an essay written in Japanese by a student at the Japanese language school. And it's just an example of, they were writing essays. They had, as I mentioned, a rigorous curriculum. They learned to read and write in Japanese, do calligraphy. They performed plays and skits, had different kinds of ceremonies and so on. So it was quite a rigorous curriculum. And using textbooks that they ordered from Japan, textbooks that had been that were regulated by the Japanese Ministry of Education. So they were getting much of the same kind of education in Tacoma that they would have gotten had they been school children in Japan at that time. We find, for me, you know, this was kind of thinking about this from my own scholarly point of view, thinking about how the transnational impact of Japanese curriculum, Japanese background, and how the Nisei brought that with them when they came to the United States, and then were able to kind of pass that on in various ways, not only in the family, but at school, pass that on to their Nisei children.
I do have to say it was such a thrill when Mary found this particular essay in the University of Washington Archives Special Collections, because we interviewed Yoneko Aochi, and this is her essay. And so just to also encourage people to think about what is in their local libraries, and also the value of having these kinds of materials to be put in larger contexts as well. But there's, you know, in addition to this, the historic importance and recognizing these connections with Japan, you know, and this is something we talked about at the beginning, Greg, that the building and the language school also impacted the social constitution of the community itself. And in many histories, looking at the pre-war period, which in many cases is just presented as the interlude between the draconian immigration laws and the war. I mean, we focus on it in a very different way that is full of life, and there's all these things to discover and to understand. But in that context, a lot of scholarship has focused on the role of the Ken associations or the religious organizations as ways that the Nisei came together, and therefore fragmented the larger Japanese American community pre-war. Because Tacoma had the single secular language school, and that was quite unique, again, as Mary noted, that the children knew each other. The Nisei children knew each other. And so many of the people that we interviewed talked about this special closeness that Tacoma had. And they say a lot has to do with the fact that they spent 2 hours a day after school every single day in this rigorous curriculum, learning Japanese language, culture, history. So in fact, in the interview with your mother and your two aunts, Greg, we will show some of that interview in a little bit, but your mother noted that, quote, the community was opposed to having two schools because it would separate into two groups. There weren't enough students. It's better to be in one group and do it well. Certain families went to a small church, for example, but they all came to the Japanese school. Right? So there's also evidence of this closeness in post-war experiences of coming back together. So Tacoma was one of the first communities to have a reunion after the war, and that was in 1977. And one of the people that we interviewed, Kaz Harita, after they had the event, was asked by the JACL to write an article for Pacific Citizen about the experience, because he said it was like a family coming together. And so there is, in fact, we were able to find his essay in Pacific Citizen, his article titled Tacoma Reunion, One Man's View. And so he writes that the reunion was the start of an abrupt journey into the pre-World War II years. Hi, remember me? Boy, he sure looks like his father did. What happened during these 35 years? I thought he was planning to be a minister. Can't believe he's a teacher now. He sure gave those teachers a hard time in his youth. She really looks great, hasn't hardly aged. My apologies for the bad time I gave you. You know, boys teasing girls. You were such a naughty boy then. These were just so many reminiscent remarks and quick impressions. It was magic. So there is something that, and again, I don't think we mentioned that we interviewed 42 Nisei who grew up in Tacoma for this book project. There was something important that made it really feel like a family. But there are other aspects, and Mary's going to elaborate on those as well. And you're muted.
Sorry about that. So one of the, as Lisa mentioned, we interviewed 42 alums of the school, former students of the school. Almost without a single exception, they mentioned the leadership of the school. The principal, Mr. Yamasaki, and his wife, Mrs. Yamasaki. And so one of the things that we kind of have to think about as we, did this project and wrote the book was what role did the Yamasakis play, not only in the Japanese language school, but in the Japanese community in Tacoma itself. And because they really shaped the educational experience of the Nisei children in Tacoma. And one of the things that we kind of really came to is the way that the Yamasakis embodied this this particular moment in Japan's history, the Meiji period, the late 1800s, the last decades of the 1800s in Japan, when Japan was going through this modernization, as I mentioned earlier, and yet trying to retain tradition. And one of the kind of keep its kind of cultural identity, even though society was changing very rapidly around it. One of the things that the Japanese government did in the 1890s was adopt or promulgate a document called the Imperial Rescript on Education. And this was something that each school child recited every day before school and in Japan. And it reiterated some of the traditional values like filial piety, hard work, self-discipline, all of these kinds of things. So very much kind of shaped the attitude of a couple of generations of Japanese people, young people. So this document, I think, one of the things that we discovered in our interviews is that the other thing that people almost uniformly mentioned was something called shushin, meaning ethics. And for ethics, the morals, the values, how do you behave, how do you comport yourself, which for many people also then boiled down to a message that they got over and over again from their parents, which was don't bring shame to the family. And so, that has some very kind of positive ideas behind it, but also some kind of sadly negative kinds of things. I think we hear this, that don't bring attention to yourself because you don't want to bring a bad name to not just to you, not just to your family, but to the Japanese community in general. Kind of shows the kind of insecurity, I think, of their status in the United States, which remained kind of conditional. As I mentioned earlier, they couldn't become naturalized US citizens. The Nisei were not US citizens. Their Nisei children were US citizens. To get back to that idea of the leadership of the school, Mr. and Mrs. Yamasaki, is how important they were in kind of shaping this generation. The school was the building, the Yamasakis were the heart of that school and what they brought to the community.
And we do have another clip. This is the Taira siblings, so Michi Taira Hori and her younger brother, Junichio. So here we hear them.
They were Mrs. Yamasaki, Yamasaki, a very gentle, kind person.
Yeah.
Of course, we were afraid of Mr. Yamasaki.
Yes. All he had to do was, and I'll never forget that face when he came to that window because we were too rowdy. Oh, I tell you, he didn't have to say a word.
Well, he must have been a great organizer or a great administrator because to get those teachers to handle us. It's amazing. After 6 hours in American school, and you go to the second school, you're not too.
Yeah, another
Except,
2 hours.
But those teachers were so dedicated. So all the focus seems to be on the principal, Mr. and Mrs. Yamasaki, but I give a lot of credit to the teachers too.
Who put up with the
Yeah.
classroom? Who is them?
Oops. Sorry, just a shorter clip of the impact that Mr. Yamasaki could have on the children. Just looking in the door, each classroom had a window, and all you had to do was look at them, and they would get back and start behaving. So the other thing is that these were children, and they were often naughty and rowdy, and they told stories of girls not wanting to sit in front of boys because they would take their ponytails and dunk them in the ink when they were doing calligraphy, and all sorts of things. So they're wonderful tales of the different aspects of becoming Nisei. Oh, and you're muted, Greg.
I am muted. Thank you very much. You know, as you folks are making your comments, I just have a couple things I'll mention here. You know, it was always interesting to me when I was growing up, and of course, this is after World War II, the Boy Scout troops and our basketball teams involved both the Buddhist temple and the Methodist temple. And I think that was by the same kind of design that they had for the Japanese language school, because they were very interested in us knowing our fellow sansei folks in the community. The other thing that strikes me every time I hear this is, you know, I told you that we spent 2 years living in the Japanese language school. We stayed in the same quarters at the Yamasaki. And you know, the way that my mother and her sisters used to speak of Yamasaki sensei was much like what we heard in the interview. Very, very strict, but very principled person. Lots of respect, and it's kind of scary that I was, you know, living in the same place that this person with such great ethics and morals was living also. I will direct us this way. I think that there's a quote that I'd like to read here. This is from Kaz Harita. It's in the book that Mary and Lisa wrote, Becoming a Nisei. It's on from page 203. So if you'll bear with me for just a second. All the old landmarks are gone. Our old house and place of business gone. Are both empty lots. Highway markets where the Japanese Americans did well. It's all built up, and I only locate them due to the fine work of our guides. I think he's speaking about the reunion. Tide flats where we played baseball and where Tokyo Beach was located, it's all filled in and industrialized. I felt a lump, a downfallen feeling. And that's from Kaz Harita from an interview. And there are pictures, I've seen pictures of those Japanese baseball teams. Great uniforms, kind of baggy, kind of very different from what you see today. But yeah, it looks, from those pictures, it looked like it was quite elite that they had. So with that, let's turn to another aspect here. Can you tell us something about what you mean by structural erasure and systematic forgetting of pre-war Japanese America? And I think, Lisa, you're going to begin here.
Thanks, Greg.
Okay.
And thank you for sharing that quote. It really is a powerful one. And we had Ryo Munakata as well. After he gave us that detailed description of Broadway, he said, but it's all gone now. Right? And so part of the argument in the book is the impact of this kind of structural erasure. What we mean by that is that and many people don't actually think about this in terms of structural or systemic kinds of practices that have produced certain types of landscapes in cities. So it's not simply that development happened, right? Urban development, oh, it's just progress, it's going on. But that a building like the Tacoma Japanese Language School ended up in disrepair because of certain types of decisions, aspects of structural racism, and things like that. So we really, in the book, we talk about the role of the anti-Asian legislation in pre-war times, such as the alien land laws in the 1920s, along clearly with wartime incarceration. That produced this kind of a landscape, right? So we want everybody to be thinking about those structural and systemic factors, not to mention just general settler colonial logics and land taking that is really ingrained in the urban processes in the United States. So in terms of Tacoma, there were only 2 buildings left that were built by the Tacoma Japanese American community and only one of them is being used for its original purpose. That's the Tacoma Buddhist Temple. Okay? Just down the street from that is the Whitney Memorial Methodist Church, and that is now the art building for the University of Washington, Tacoma. So not its original purpose, but it's still standing. So in the book, and here I'm going to do a quick screen share again. There are 2 photos, and I think I'm going to have to do them back to back, or maybe I'll just do this quickly. Whoops, I apologize. There are 2 photos, and here you see one of them, which is Broadway, right? Looking on 13th to 15th area, vibrant, lots of people, stores, life is all together. In the other photo, which I don't see just at the moment on my screen, but I'll get in a second, it's all gone. There are parking lots, a tall hotel, and many vacant lots. So we had an RA, research assistant on this project, Sarah Pyle, who documented of the 40 discrete buildings that were mentioned 3 or more times by our Nisei interviewees. Okay, so 40 buildings mentioned 3 or more times. That means multiple people talked about those places. By 2018, 36 of those 40 were either vacant or they were parking lots. So that's what we mean by structural erasure, systemic forgetting. And we also use this term collective amnesia, which is emphasizing that we are all a part of these processes. It takes all of us to continue this type of silencing, to continue this type of forgetting. And so it's a bit of a call as well to make sure that we don't continue to perpetuate this. There's a couple scholars that we draw on that talk about that the past is not dead, but it is forgotten and buried. So there might be these flashes that we hear, and we need to make sure that those silences are not continued, but that we have these kinds of conversations, try to publish this material, and to make other kinds of moves to change things.
So this erasure that Lisa is talking about is really directly related and directly an outgrowth of what happened to the Japanese community with World War II and the incarceration. And so, we wanted to talk a little bit about what happened to the Japanese community, Tacoma's Japanese community, with incarceration. Principal Yamasaki, who we had talked about earlier, was one of 22 Tacomans who was arrested in the days just after Pearl Harbor by the FBI. FBI surveillance of Japanese Americans had begun in 1932, and they were categorized as, all in different categories of suspicion. And Japanese language school principals, teachers, people, photographers, Japanese photographers, people who belonged to any kind of a martial arts club. These were all considered suspicious. These and others were all considered suspicious characters. So Yamasaki, Principal Yamasaki, was arrested on December 8th, something like that. He was taken to Montana, put into a detention camp in Montana, and eventually transferred to Lordsburg, New Mexico, with the United States Army maintained as a special detention center during the overall incarceration period. And he died there in March of 1943. Tragically young and tragically, in this period of incarceration. The Japanese language school, Tacoma's Japanese language school, ironically, was used as a civilian control center where the Japanese in Tacoma were expected and required to register for their, to be moved into the incarceration camps. Most in Tacoma were sent first to Pinedale Assembly Center and then on to Tule Lake in California when that facility was ready. One thing that we wanted to kind of mention as we kind of wrap things up here is going back, linking this back to the Tacoma Language School, Japanese Language School, and the effectiveness of the curriculum there. That the Japanese students of that school emerged speaking good Japanese. The U.S. military knew about that, and when eventually 106 Nisei young men from Tacoma served in the United States military during the wartime, and of those 106, 55 served in the military intelligence service. So that's over 50% of the people from Tacoma who served in the military intelligence service. And that compares overall to about 33,000 Nisei men served in the US Armed Forces during World War II. And only 6,000 of those served in military intelligence. So that's shows that Tacoma did have a reputation and have a deserved reputation for being very capable in Japanese language, and I think that is directly related to the role that the Japanese language school played in Tacoma. So, again, most of the Tacomans were incarcerated in California, and so we have some. Greg, I think that your mother, you mentioned earlier that all of the stories that your mother told, and some of them probably also from her camp experience.
Yes, I remember my mother said that they had a couple of weeks to get ready to leave. They left in May of 1942. She also told me that in December of 1941, the Federal Bureau of Investigations came looking for her father. And he had passed away in April of 1941. They thought that he was still alive. They didn't know that he had passed away, and they were asking people that, she was hearing back from people that they were looking for him. The other thing that I think that you mentioned was that the Japanese language school was used as a registration center for the people that were going to be interned. And I remember I probably was in maybe junior high or high school. My uncle would every so often, my uncle Leo Kawasaki would have us accompany him into the Japanese language school just to kind of check on things. And there were a couple rooms, I imagine they were classrooms I remember going into, and they were just piled with steamer trunks and people's belongings. And this was suitcases, this was everything, everyday items, kimonos, personal effects. And we'd go in there and just kind of check on things, but you could tell that people had been getting into the building and things were being tossed around. I also remember as a young child being able to go into the assembly hall, and there was a performance stage there, raised stage, and there was a little trapdoor underneath. And so we used to go in the trapdoor and take a look at what was underneath the stage. And there were all of these costumes, wonderful paper mache masks, samurai costumes, animal costumes from the days when it was a school. And eventually all those things ended up disappearing also. So those are some of the things that just kind of quickly came to my mind as you were commenting there. Another thing that my mother and her sisters would tell us, that when they arrived at Tule Lake Relocation Center, there were 10,000 Japanese there. And my mother used to say she had never seen so many people with black hair in one place at one time. There were people from all over the place. You mentioned a story about you know, how they were kind of reacting to that. And she told me once that right after they ended up getting to, well, they were moved to Heart Mountain. Right after they were moved to Heart Mountain, her mother and of course, it was her mother, because my mother, my grandmother, and 3 daughters. So there were no brothers, no husbands at that time. And her mother said, okay, I got 3 daughters here. I want to tell you guys, you need to watch out for those California boys because they're bad news. Well, my father was from Los Angeles. So it's kind of interesting how that worked out that way. He turned out, I guess he was one of the okay ones or something. I don't know. Anyway, so with that, I'll let you folks comment on what you know about that experience for folks in the relocation camp.
Great, thank you, Greg. So we did actually hear quite a few comments about what happened when they went to the camps and met people from other places. Rio Munakata talked about how it was so strange to see other Japanese not bowing to people they saw, because he would bow to everybody because it was such a tight-knit community and they knew each other, but these were really strangers to each other. They also talked about how they would speak Japanese to themselves, but other people didn't speak Japanese, and that was startling. And there were some comments about the wild boys from Hawaii as well, and you can guess that there were some of the female Niseis that we interviewed had those comments. We're just going to share a short clip before we finish up here today. And these are the 3 Fujimoto sisters. So this is Greg's mother in the yellow and his 2 aunts along with her. And they'll also talk about their experiences.
Always felt that we were one of the lucky ones because our community was so united and we all knew each other and we helped each other. Whereas in California and even in Seattle, the population of the Japanese is so much larger that they didn't have that privilege of being united, I don't think.
Mhm.
But I think we were lucky.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Like they say, it's only Tacoma that can have those big reunions, Japanese reunions, yes, because we're so close-knit. We knew everybody. So.
And a lot of that, I think we owe to our principal, Japanese school principal, because he really steered us all into the right direction. Yeah.
When you say that, you mean, it sounds like you mean not just students, but the
The whole
the
family,
parents.
oh yeah, because they used to have PTAs all the time, and I think the parents were equally told how to behave and you know all that. So
Yeah, I thought every Japanese was good. And when I went into camp and saw some of them, I thought, wow. They have different kinds too.
yeah, it's
So we will pass it to you, Greg, to close us out here. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Lisa, Mary. And you know, as I was watching that video again, and I get a chance to see it every once in a while, that is exactly the same order that those 3 would sit when it came to Thanksgiving or Christmas or what. I don't know why that always was, but Auntie Io was on our far left, my Auntie Teddy in the middle, and my mother on the far right. So they'd line up and they would have these stories that they would tell us, and they would complete sentences for each other and sometimes tell punchlines as a chorus, and it was very, very interesting. Are there other questions? Are there any other questions that we might explore? Okay. So would this be a good time to do the Rising Bright Sun? Yamasaki Sensei wrote this song, and as I understand it, it is based upon a song that is used in the Japanese schools at the time, but he altered it a little bit. And what we're going to try and do here is play that song. I don't know who, can somebody play that for me? I can try.
I will start it.
Okay.
Here we go.
And we'll say that this is Mrs.
Hi, my name is Katz Fujita. I was 13 years old when our family was sent to Pinedale Assembly Center near Fresno, California. I had attended the Tacoma Japanese Language School for 5 years. The Tacoma Japanese Language School song is titled Toyo Saka Noboru, translated Rising Bright Sun. I don't have the music for the song, and it's been over 50 years, so I'll have to sing it a cappella. Please bear with me.
And I will try and give you some of the words in English as we're going along here.
Toyo saka noboru hiromoto no kiyoki chishi o mi ni ukete.
Children of the pure blood,
No mihata no Amerika ni umare shinwa
from the land of the rising sun,
ari. Aoge mata kakirei hoya. Ozome ga fuka
and born in America,
no. Shi no shizen no misato shiro.
the Star-Spangled Banner flies.
Hagemu beshi. Warera wa wachu kyoroku shi.
We have a special mission,
Kenma okotarasu. Yono tame tsu.
sense of special purpose,
Ibi ni tsuchikai susumu beshi.
uniting both of the ways,
Yo tairiku no noya hiroku. Taiheiyo wa
and not neglecting to train ourselves.
Warera no mune ni moeru chiyo. Wakaki kibou ni
For the sake of the world,
Asamyaku no waga kenji.
let us go forward every day
Yoku uchi furui. Bandi no sora o tobanto.
to cultivate our true minds.
誰がすらちしこの里を昔忘れず思い出よ
So I think that's how I'd like to end our session here. I thought that as I read those lyrics again, I thought, boy, that is something that Yamasaki Sensei really seemed to have a sense of the place he was at and the times he was at and the community he was in. And I think also it makes me remember how fragile communities and places are and how important they are in people's upbringing. I've had the opportunity to reflect on some of the things that I remember from my early childhood. And I've also had a chance to reflect on how some of those things that not just my aunts and and my mother shared with me, but just kind of how things were in the early 50s and 60s when I was growing up. And there was a small enclave of Japanese Americans that were, very much attached to the Tacoma Buddhist Temple and the Whitney Memorial Methodist Church. Times that we spent together, us boys as Boy Scouts and playing basketball. And many of those things that I think Lisa and Mary have pointed out are things that I get a chance to actually experience and feel. And so I appreciate the work that the two of you have done, because it's given me a richer way of looking at kind of who I am. And I hope that other folks who have had a chance to see this will take a look at communities that maybe they're coming from, whether they be Japanese American or other communities, and reflect on that. How do we preserve some of those things knowing that they're going to change? And that's a tough one. That's a really tough one. So those are my parting comments. Lisa, Mary?
I just want to say thank you for joining us today, Greg. It's been fantastic having this conversation, and thank you everybody for attending. And thank you for the centers for inviting us here today.
Let me just ditto that. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Greg.
You're welcome.